The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and steel, its windows holding the sprawling, glittering tapestry of the city at bay. Tonight it was the temple of Eleanor, and everyone present was a devoted worshiper. It was her 40th birthday, a fact she announced with the defiant pride of someone who believed age was just another acquisition she could afford. Her husband Mark stood slightly behind her, a shadow in a well-tailored suit, his presence as functional and unnoticed as the polished marble beneath their feet. He had arranged everything, from the catering by a chef who flew in from Paris to the specific vintage of champagne that now filled the flutes of their guests. He was the architect of the evening, yet he remained invisible. Richard Davenport, Eleanor's father, a man whose posture was as rigid as his opinions, held his glass aloft. His voice, accustomed to commanding boardrooms, boomed with false sentimentality. "To my daughter, Eleanor, a woman who has never settled for anything less than the absolute best, in life, in business, and in taste." His eyes flickered toward Mark for a fraction of a second, a glint of something that was not quite approval, not quite disdain, but a bland mixture of both. The guests, a curated collection of the city's wealthy and influential, murmured their agreement. Eleanor beamed, her smile as bright and hard as the diamonds at her throat. She took her own glass, the crystal ringing softly as she tapped it with a perfectly manicured nail. "Thank you, Daddy." Her gaze swept the room, a queen surveying her court. Then her eyes landed on Mark. The smile didn't falter, but it changed. It sharpened, honed by years of quiet resentments and unspoken disappointments. "Daddy's right," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly hushed room. "I've always aimed for the best." She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting every eye follow her gaze to her husband. "Of course, we all have to compromise somewhere. We can't all have everything." She laughed, a light, tinkling sound that was utterly devoid of humor. "I mean, look at Mark. I settled for you, darling, but you do throw a wonderful party." The words hung in the air, glittering and venomous. A few people chuckled uncomfortably. Liam, Eleanor's brother, barked a laugh that was too loud, too genuine. Richard's face was a mask of smug satisfaction. Catherine, Eleanor's mother, looked down at her glass, her lips a thin, unhappy line. But she said nothing. She never said anything. And Mark? Mark just stood there. He didn't flinch. He didn't scowl. His expression remained one of placid calm, his eyes fixed on his wife. The humiliation was a physical thing, a wave of heat that washed over him, felt by everyone in the room. They saw a man diminished, a husband publicly castrated by the woman who was supposed to be his partner. They saw a quiet, unassuming man being told he was a compromise, a consolation prize. They thought they understood everything. They didn't know the first thing. Within 60 seconds, their entire world, the very foundation of their wealth and status, would be fractured beyond repair. What they didn't know was that the quiet man they pitied was not the shadow in the room. He was the room itself. I hope you're settling in, because this is a story you're going to want to see through to the end. If you're enjoying it so far, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to that silent room, where the air was crackling with a tension no one but Mark understood. After Eleanor's devastating pronouncement, Mark's stillness was unnerving. He didn't look angry. He didn't look hurt. He looked patient, as if he were waiting for a storm he had long predicted to finally break. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his water, the simple act a shocking counterpoint to the emotional violence just inflicted upon him. He set the glass down on a nearby table with a soft click that echoed in the silence. He met Eleanor's triumphant, challenging gaze, and then he spoke. His voice was not loud, not filled with rage or indignation. It was calm, measured, and carried the weight of absolute finality. He said 3 words. This building is mine. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer just awkward. It was heavy, confused, and absolute. Richard was the first to break it, his laugh a harsh, grating sound. "What did you say, Mark? For a moment there, I thought you said you own this building. You've had too much of your own expensive champagne, my boy." Liam snickered beside him. "Good one, Mark, finally developing a sense of humor." But Eleanor wasn't laughing. She was staring at her husband, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes for the first time that night. There was a quality in his voice she had never heard before, a cold, hard certainty that chilled her. Mark's gaze didn't waver from hers. He didn't need to raise his voice. He had planted a seed of doubt, and now he would let it grow into the terrifying truth. The party was over. The real event was just beginning. To understand the weight of those three words, you have to understand the years that preceded them. You have to understand the 10,000 quiet cuts Mark had endured. Their life together had been built on a carefully constructed narrative, written by the Davenports and for the Davenports. In this story, Mark was a supporting character, a footnote in the grand tale of their success. He was an architect, a respectable profession, but one they treated with a kind of bemused condescension. He designed buildings. Richard Davenport owned them. It was a simple, clear hierarchy, one they reinforced at every opportunity. Their first meeting had been a setup by a mutual friend. Eleanor, then 30, was feeling the pressure to marry. Mark, 32, was quiet, intelligent, and kind. He was handsome in an understated way that she found acceptable. He was, in her family's assessment, stable. He ran a small boutique firm with a partner, taking on projects that were critically acclaimed, but not, in Richard's view, commercially significant. "He's an artist, not a businessman," Richard had declared after their first meeting, a pronouncement that was meant to be both a compliment and a dismissal. It was the label that stuck. Mark, the gentle artist. Mark, the man who couldn't possibly understand the cut-and-thrust world of real power and real money where the Davenports resided. He had loved Eleanor then, or at least he had loved the idea of her. He saw a flicker of vulnerability beneath a polished, confident exterior. He thought he could be the one to see the real person, to nurture a partnership built on mutual respect. He was wrong. What he had mistaken for vulnerability was merely insecurity, a deep-seated fear of not living up to her family's staggering expectations. And her solution to that insecurity was not to build herself up, but to diminish him. It started subtly. A casual remark about his car in front of her friends, a suggestion that he let her father's tailor fix him up, an insistence that they live in an apartment owned by her father, a constant, tangible reminder of his supposed dependence. The humiliation became a ritual, a cornerstone of their marriage. At family dinners, Richard would hold court, pontificating about his latest deal, the millions made, the rivals crushed. He would then turn to Mark and ask, with theatrical interest, "And how's the little drawing business, son? Still managing to pay the bills?" Liam would chime in with a joke about Mark's latest project, a community library or a small art gallery. "Saving the world one bookshelf at a time, eh, Mark?" he'd say, clapping him on the back with enough force to make him stumble. And Eleanor would smile, a tight, complicit smile that said, "This is the price of admission to my world. Endure it." Catherine, her mother, would busy herself with the serving dishes, her silence a form of passive consent. She saw the cruelty, Mark knew she did, but her loyalty to her husband's ego was stronger than her sense of decency. Mark endured it all with a preternatural calm. He would meet Richard's condescension with a polite, non-committal nod. He would absorb Liam's barbs with a quiet smile. He never argued. He never defended himself. They mistook his patience for weakness. They saw his dignity as passivity. They had no idea that behind his calm gray eyes, a different kind of architect was at work, not designing buildings of glass and steel, but a structure of justice, meticulously planned and patiently waiting for the right moment for its unveiling. They didn't know that Mark's little drawing business was a front, a passion he maintained, but not his primary enterprise. His real work, conducted through his quiet, unassuming partner David Chen, was in strategic investment and acquisition. He had learned early on that the loudest person in the room is often the most fragile. Real power didn't announce itself. It observed, it waited, and it moved in silence. The preparation for Eleanor's 40th birthday party was the culmination of a decade of these small indignities. She had treated him not as a husband, but as a high-end event planner. She handed him a list of demands, each more extravagant than the last. "The Chevalier penthouse, Mark. I don't care what it costs. Daddy says it's the best view in the city." "Chef Dubois. He's booked a year in advance, but I'm sure you can work something out. Offer him more money. And for my gift, I want the diamond necklace from Bellini's, the one in the front window. Don't get me the smaller version, I'll know." Each request was an assertion of her power and his subservience. He complied with every single one, his calm efficiency further proof, in her mind, of his role as her facilitator. He secured the Chevalier penthouse with a single phone call. He didn't have to negotiate or plead. The building manager, a man named Henderson, was deferential, almost reverent. "Of course, sir, the penthouse is always available to you. Shall I inform the staff that you'll be hosting?" Mark had simply replied, "No, Henderson. The booking will be under my wife's name. As far as anyone is concerned, I'm just a guest." He booked Chef Dubois, who was indeed booked a year in advance, but who cleared his schedule immediately upon hearing who was really asking. He bought the Bellini necklace, paying for it from an account the Davenports knew nothing about, an account whose balance could have purchased Richard's entire company several times over. He did all this, playing the part of the dutiful, accommodating husband, while inside, the final pieces of his grand design were clicking into place. He knew this party would be the breaking point. Eleanor, emboldened by the extravagance and surrounded by her sycophants, would overplay her hand, and when she did, he would be ready. In the breast pocket of his suit jacket, he carried a simple, folded document. It was not a weapon, it was the truth, and it was about to bring the entire temple crashing down. The evening of the party began as he had expected. He stood at the door beside Eleanor, a welcoming smile fixed on his face as she greeted their guests. To them, he was an accessory, like her clutch or her earrings. "Eleanor, you look stunning. The view is just breathtaking," they'd gush, their eyes sliding right past Mark as if he were part of the decor. Richard and Catherine arrived, Richard sweeping in as if he were the host, immediately directing a waiter to open a different bottle of wine he'd brought, a subtle undermining of Mark's own selection. "This is a proper vintage," he announced to anyone who would listen. Liam arrived with a model on his arm and a smirk on his face. He bypassed a handshake with Mark and went straight for a backslap. "Still here, eh, Marky? Hanging in there. Good for you." Mark moved through the party, an island of calm in a sea of performative wealth. He ensured glasses were filled, that the music was at the perfect volume, that Chef Dubois had everything he needed. He was fulfilling his role as the perfect host, the facilitator, just as Eleanor wanted. But he was also observing. He saw the way her friends looked at him with pitying smiles. He heard the snippets of conversation, the casual dismissal of his profession. He watched Richard hold court by the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows, gesturing out at the city lights. "I built half of this skyline," Richard boasted, a gross exaggeration that no one dared to challenge. "It's about vision, guts, something you can't learn from a textbook." His eyes found Mark across the room, and he gave a small, condescending shake of his head. Mark felt a familiar, cold knot in his stomach. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something closer to disappointment. He had wanted this family to be his. He had been prepared to love them, to share his life with them. But they had never wanted a son or a brother. They had wanted an audience. They had wanted a mirror that would reflect back their own inflated self-image. And his quiet, unassuming nature was the perfect, polished surface for that reflection. He slipped his hand into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the crisp edges of the folded document. It felt cool and solid, a tangible link to a reality they couldn't see. It was a copy of the final transfer of ownership for Chevalier Tower, registered to a holding company named M.A. Holdings. His holding company. The building Richard was using as a prop for his own ego had been Mark's for 6 months. He thought back to the day he bought it. It had been part of a larger acquisition. Richard's company, Davenport Properties, had been over-leveraged for years, a fact Richard expertly concealed with bluster and bravado. He was a brilliant salesman but a reckless manager. 2 years ago, during a market downturn, the banks had called in his loans. He was on the verge of bankruptcy, a secret he kept even from his own family. It was David Chen who had brought the opportunity to Mark. "Davenport's is drowning," David had said, sliding a portfolio across Mark's desk. "The debt is available for pennies on the dollar. We could acquire the entire company, assets and all, without him ever knowing who's behind it until it's done." Mark had hesitated. This wasn't just a business deal. It was his family, his wife's family. "Can't we just prop him up?" Mark had asked. "An anonymous bailout?" David had shaken his head. "He's a bad captain, Mark. He'll just sink the ship again. The only way to save the assets, to save the employees, is to take the wheel. We can structure it so he stays on as a figurehead, keeps his salary, his dignity. No one has to know." And so, Mark had agreed. Through a series of shell corporations and intermediaries, M.A. Holdings had bought the debt, restructured the company, and saved it from implosion. Richard Davenport thought he had been saved by a mysterious consortium of foreign investors who were, in his words, smart enough to know a good leader when they see one. He had no idea his savior was the quiet man he patronized at Sunday dinner. Mark had kept his secret, hoping that with the company stabilized, Richard might soften, that the family's relentless need for superiority might fade. He was wrong. Their arrogance only grew, fed by a success they didn't realize wasn't their own. Now at the party, the final act of this long drama was about to unfold. He saw Eleanor making her way to the center of the room, tapping her glass for attention. The moment had arrived. He felt his heart rate quicken, not with fear, but with a strange, solemn resolve. He was not an avenging angel. He was simply an architect, and the foundations of this family were rotten. It was time to show them. He watched his wife, the woman he had once loved, raise her glass, her face flushed with champagne and triumph. He listened to her father's boastful toast, and then he listened as she delivered the line she must have thought was so witty, so devastatingly clever. "I settled for you, darling." The words echoed in the sudden silence, and Mark knew with absolute certainty that he was not the one who had settled. She was. She had settled for a life of glittering surfaces, of inherited status and borrowed glory. She had settled for the comfort of arrogance over the challenge of a genuine partnership. And in doing so, she had failed to see the quiet, incredible man standing right in front of her, the man who owned her entire world. The seconds after Mark said, "This building is mine," stretched into an eternity. The air, once filled with chatter and music, was now a vacuum, sucking the breath from 100 lungs. Richard's dismissive laugh had died in his throat, leaving a strained, ugly grin on his face. He looked from Mark's impossibly calm expression to his daughter's confused one. "Mark, that's enough," he said, his voice losing its booming confidence, replaced by a sharp, paternal command. "You're embarrassing your wife." Mark didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on Eleanor. "Am I, Eleanor?" he asked softly. "Am I embarrassing you?" She finally found her voice, though it was a shaky, uncertain thing. "What are you doing, Mark? Stop this. Everyone is staring." "They're staring because they, like you, have been operating under a false assumption for a very long time, Mark said. His voice was still quiet, but it now had a pedagogical quality, like a professor beginning a lecture. He turned his gaze from his wife and let it sweep across the room, meeting the eyes of the stunned guests, before finally settling on his father-in-law. You've all been enjoying the hospitality of Davenport Properties tonight. You've been admiring the view from the Chevalier penthouse, the crown jewel of the Davenport portfolio. Richard puffed out his chest, regaining a sliver of his bravado. That's right, and I'll thank you not to make a scene in it. That's where you're mistaken, Richard, Mark said, the use of his first name a deliberate, calculated breach of their established dynamic. You see, you haven't been the majority owner of Davenport Properties for over 18 months. You've been its handsomely paid, but largely ceremonial, president. A collective gasp went through the room. Richard's face, already florid from wine and self-satisfaction, turned a dangerous shade of purple. That is a preposterous lie. My lawyers, my board. Your board answers to the majority shareholder, Mark interrupted smoothly. A company you know as the Vesper Group. The mysterious foreign investors who saved you from bankruptcy 2 years ago. You've praised their wisdom, their hands-off approach. You've never once bothered to look into who was actually behind them. He let that statement hang in the air, another devastating payload. Liam, who had been smirking, now looked pale and confused. Catherine had her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with dawning horror. Eleanor just stared, her mind clearly struggling to process the impossible words her husband was saying. "And who is behind them, Mark?" Richard snarled, his voice a low growl. "Some hedge fund punk who thinks he can intimidate me?" Mark gave a small, almost sad smile. He reached into his jacket pocket and slowly withdrew the folded document. He didn't flourish it. He held it with a quiet reverence. Vesper Group is a subsidiary of a private equity firm called Chen and Associates. And Chen and Associates is the investment arm of a design and development company called M.A. Holdings. He paused, letting the initials sink in. Mark Anderson, M.A. He unfolded the paper. It was the deed to the building. And M.A. Holdings, Richard, is me. It has always been me. The finality of it was absolute. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't gloating. He was simply stating a fact, as one might state the time or the temperature. This calm, factual delivery made it all the more terrifying for the Davenports. There was no room for argument, no opening for bluster. "So you see," Mark continued, his voice now a soft murmur that forced everyone to lean in. "When I say this building is mine, it's not a joke. It's a statement of fact. This penthouse, the floors below it, the company that bears your name, the car you drive, the club membership you prize so highly, they are all, in a very real sense, mine." He finally looked back at his wife, whose face had crumbled into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "The money for this party, Eleanor? The chef, the champagne, the dress you're wearing, the diamonds around your neck. That didn't come from your father's generosity. It came from mine." He let his gaze drift down to the stunning Bellini necklace. "I hope you like your birthday gift. I was happy to buy it for you." The implication was clear and devastating. Her grand gesture of status, the ultimate symbol of her luxurious life, was a gift from the man she had just publicly declared a compromise. She had been performing her superiority with his money in his building. The situational irony was so thick, so potent, that it was almost suffocating. The guests, who moments before had been laughing at Mark's expense, now shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the shattered family and the quiet architect who had just revealed himself to be a king. They were witnesses to a coup, a bloodless, devastating overthrow of a dynasty. Just then, as if on cue, the doors to the penthouse elevators slid open. A man stepped out. He was of medium height, with a sharp suit and an air of quiet intensity. It was David Chen. He carried a leather briefcase. He walked calmly through the stunned crowd, which parted for him as if by magic, and came to stand beside Mark. He gave a slight, respectful nod. "Mark, I trust I'm not too late." "Right on time, David," Mark said. Richard stared at David, his mind racing. He recognized him from somewhere. A meeting, a conference call with the Vesper Group. "You," he stammered, "you're their legal counsel." "I am," David said, his voice crisp and professional. "But my primary client is Mr. Anderson. I am the Chen of Chen and Associates." He opened his briefcase and produced a thick file. "Should you or your attorneys have any questions regarding the ownership structure of Davenport Properties or any of its assets, including this building, I have all the relevant documentation right here." He placed the file on the table next to Mark's water glass. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. The sound of a world ending. The sound of a new one beginning. The aftermath of the revelation was not an explosion, but a slow, agonizing collapse. The air crackled with the sound of a dynasty turning to dust. Richard Davenport, a man who had built his identity on the foundations of control and command, looked utterly broken. He sank into a nearby armchair, his body deflating as if his bones had suddenly dissolved. He stared at the file on the table, the simple manila folder that contained the legal truth of his ruin. He made no move to touch it. To touch it would be to accept it, and his pride, though mortally wounded, was not yet dead. Liam, ever the beta to his father's alpha, looked lost. His usual arsenal of snide remarks and casual cruelty was useless here. He looked at Mark with a new, terrified respect. This wasn't the brother-in-law he could mock. This was a predator who had been living among them, disguised as prey for a decade. He backed away slowly, as if proximity to Mark might cause him to vanish completely. Catherine was the most expressive of all, though her expression was one of silent, profound grief. Tears streamed down her face, not for the loss of wealth or status, but, Mark suspected, for the loss of the family she thought she had. She looked at Mark, and in her eyes, he saw a flicker of shame, a decade's worth of complicit silence finally catching up to her. She had watched her husband and son chip away at this man's dignity for years, and now she was witnessing the consequences. She had enabled the bullies, and the victim had turned out to be the most powerful person in the room. And Eleanor. Eleanor was a statue of shattered pride. Her face was ashen, the vibrant life from moments before completely drained away. The Bellini necklace, once a symbol of her triumph, now seemed to be a heavy, mocking weight around her neck. She took a tentative step toward Mark, her hand outstretched. "Mark," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I was joking. You know I was joking. It was a stupid, stupid joke." Mark looked at her, and for the first time he felt not patience, not disappointment, but a deep, hollow sadness. "Was it a joke, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Was it a joke all those times you let your father insult my work? Was it a joke when you let your brother mock me in front of our friends? Was it a joke every time you reminded me that we were living in your father's apartment?" This was his list of grievances, delivered not with anger, but with the cold, hard clarity of a surgeon's scalpel. Each question was a precise cut, laying bare the diseased tissue of their marriage. "This wasn't about one comment tonight, Eleanor," he continued. "This was about 1,000 comments, 1,000 moments of disrespect. You didn't just settle for me, you tried to diminish me, to make me small so that you could feel big. You married a man, but you wanted a project you could renovate or a servant you could command. I was neither." The guests began to quietly excuse themselves, murmuring apologies, desperate to escape the raw, unbearable intimacy of the scene. They were sharks who had scented blood, but this was a kind of carnage they had no stomach for. It was too personal, too profound. Soon the vast penthouse was empty, save for Mark, David, and the wreckage of the Davenport family. "What do you want, Mark?" Richard finally choked out from his chair, his voice a raspy shadow of its former self. To humiliate us? To throw us out on the street? Is this your revenge? Mark turned to him. Revenge? He shook his head slowly. No, Richard, this isn't revenge. This is a correction. For 10 years, you have all lived in a fiction of your own making. I am simply introducing you to reality. He picked up the file David had brought. As of tomorrow morning, the Board of Davenport Properties will vote to accept your resignation as president. You will be given a generous severance package and offered a position as a senior consultant, should you choose to accept it. Your salary will remain the same. You will not be thrown out on the street. You will simply be removed from a position you were no longer qualified to hold. It was a masterstroke of strategy. He wasn't destroying Richard, he was pensioning him off. He was offering him a golden cage, a way to maintain the appearance of his lifestyle without any of the power. It was a form of poetic justice so perfect, so complete, that it was more devastating than outright ruin. He then looked at Eleanor. You and I will talk tomorrow about the terms of our separation. The word separation hit her like a physical blow. No, she pleaded, the last vestiges of her composure crumbling. Mark, no. We can fix this. I can fix this. I love you. Mark's expression softened with a deep, weary sorrow. You love the idea of me, Eleanor. You love what I provide, but you don't respect me. And love, real love, cannot survive without respect. It's been starved to death, year by year, comment by comment. It died tonight. I'm just signing the death certificate. He turned to David. David, please see the Davenports out. He walked away toward the far end of the penthouse, leaving his lawyer to manage the quiet, dignified eviction. He stood before the vast window, looking out at the city he now, in so many ways, owned. The lights twinkled below, a sea of indifferent stars. He felt no triumph, no elation, only the quiet, heavy peace of a long overdue ending. The architect had finally cleared the site. The question was, what would he build now? The days that followed were a study in disintegration. The carefully polished veneer of the Davenport family cracked and then shattered, revealing the rot beneath. Richard, stripped of his authority, seemed to age a decade overnight. He refused the consultancy position, his pride unable to stomach the idea of being a paid advisor to a company he once owned, taking orders from a man he once derided. He spent his days in his study, a deposed king in a silent castle, drinking expensive scotch that Mark was still, technically, paying for. He refused to speak to Mark, or even about him. He simply pretended he no longer existed, a psychological defense against a reality too humiliating to bear. Liam reacted with a surprising, desperate pragmatism. The day after the party, he called Mark. His voice, usually dripping with sarcasm, was now thin and reedy, laced with a sycophantic terror. Mark, man, look. I've been a complete jerk. I know that. I was just, following my dad's lead. It was stupid. But listen, about the company. I run the acquisitions department. I know all the deals in the pipeline. I can be really valuable to you. Mark listened patiently as Liam debased himself, offering loyalty in exchange for security. He saw that Liam's cruelty wasn't born of genuine malice, but of a deep, pathetic insecurity. He had only ever been his father's son. Without the Davenport name meaning what it once did, he was nothing. Mark didn't fire him. He kept him on, but demoted him, placing him under a sharp, no-nonsense executive who would not tolerate his laziness. It was another lesson in consequences, more effective than termination. Liam would learn the value of hard work and humility, or he would wash out on his own. Catherine was the one who surprised him. 2 days after the party, she came to the penthouse. Mark let her in. She looked tired, her face etched with a sadness that went beyond their current circumstances. They sat in the vast, silent living room, the scene of the crime. I am so sorry, Mark, she began, her voice barely a whisper. I have been a coward for 10 years. I saw what they were doing to you. I saw your kindness and your patience, and I said nothing." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for an understanding he wasn't sure he could give. "I loved my husband's strength, his ambition. I think somewhere along the way, I mistook his arrogance for strength. I let it become the center of our family. I let it poison everything." Mark listened, saying nothing. "There is no excuse for my silence," she continued. "I failed you, and I failed my daughter. I taught her that a man's worth was measured by his volume, by the size of his deals. I never taught her to look for quiet strength, to value character over charisma." She stood up, her movements frail. "I don't know if our family can be fixed, but I wanted you to know that I see you now, Mark. I truly see you, and I am ashamed." She left without waiting for a response, her confession hanging in the air. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness, but a statement of fact. It was the first truly honest thing a Davenport had said to him in a decade. His meeting with Eleanor was the most difficult. They met at a neutral location, a quiet cafe downtown. She looked smaller, stripped of her designer clothes and her defiant confidence. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back, her face pale and devoid of makeup. She looked like the woman he had first met, before the weight of her family's expectations had crushed her. She didn't make excuses. She didn't try to bargain. She just cried. Softly at first, and then with racking sobs that shook her entire body. "I ruined it," she wept. "I had this wonderful, kind, brilliant man who loved me, and I ruined it because I was a spoiled, insecure brat. I was so afraid of not being a Davenport that I forgot how to be a person." Mark passed her a napkin. He felt a pang of the old affection, the muscle memory of wanting to comfort her. But he knew that path was closed forever. "My father, he always made it seem like we were at war," she explained, trying to make him understand. "It was us against the world. You had to be the best, the richest, the most powerful. Anything less was a failure. When I met you, you were so calm, so content. It scared me. It felt like weakness, because I didn't understand it. So I pushed you. I let them push you. I thought I needed to make you more like them. I was so wrong." He listened to her confession, and he believed she was sincere. But sincerity wasn't enough. The damage was too deep, the foundations too compromised. "I believe you, Eleanor," he said when she had finished, "and I hope, for your sake, that this is the beginning of you finding out who you are without the Davenport name attached. I will make sure you are taken care of. You will have the apartment, a generous settlement. You won't have to worry about money." "I don't care about the money," she whispered, looking up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "I care about you. Can't we start over?" He shook his head, the sadness in his heart a heavy, physical weight. "The man you want to start over with doesn't exist anymore, Eleanor. You and your family killed him over the last 10 years. The man who is left, he's someone different. He's learned to protect himself." He stood up from the table. "I wish you well. I truly do. I hope you find happiness." He walked out of the cafe, leaving her with the bill for 2 coffees and the wreckage of their marriage. It was a clean break, a necessary amputation. He knew it would hurt, but it was the only way to stop the poison from spreading further. The architect was finally free of the flawed structure he had been trapped in. He was standing on clear ground, with a new blueprint, this time for his own life. 6 months passed. The city transitioned from the crisp chill of autumn to the deep freeze of winter, and then to the tentative warmth of spring. The changes in Mark's life were just as profound. He had moved out of the Chevalier penthouse, leaving it to Eleanor as part of the divorce settlement. It was a place of ghosts and bad memories. He bought a smaller, more intimate apartment in a quieter part of the city, one he had designed himself years ago. It was a space that reflected him, clean lines, honest materials, and an unobtrusive strength. He had restructured Davenport Properties from the top down. He promoted a talented woman from within to the position of CEO, and together they transformed the company's culture from one of aggressive, high-risk gambles to one of sustainable, intelligent growth. The employees who had lived in fear of Richard's volatile temper were thriving. The company was more profitable and more stable than it had ever been. Mark took no public credit, remaining the silent owner, guiding from the shadows. His satisfaction came not from recognition, but from seeing a broken thing made whole and healthy. Richard never did accept the consultancy role. After a few months of aimless bitterness, Catherine finally gave him an ultimatum: get help or she would leave him. Faced with the loss of the last person who truly cared for him, Richard had begun seeing a therapist. The process was slow and painful, but for the first time in his life, he was being forced to confront the insecurity that fueled his arrogance. His relationship with Catherine was slowly, tentatively, being rebuilt on a new foundation of honesty. Liam had surprised everyone. Humbled by his demotion and terrified of losing his job, he had actually started to work. Stripped of his father's protection, he had to rely on his own merits, and he discovered, to his own astonishment, that he had some. He was still arrogant, still had a long way to go, but there was a flicker of something new in him: self-awareness. Eleanor had sold the penthouse. It was too large, too lonely, and too full of memories of her public downfall. She used the money from the divorce to go back to school, studying art history, a passion she had abandoned in her 20s to join her father's company. She was, for the first time, doing something for herself, not for her family's approval. Mark heard through a mutual friend that she seemed quieter, more thoughtful, perhaps even happy. He hoped it was true. One sunny afternoon, Mark was walking through a park near his new apartment when he saw a familiar figure on a bench. It was Catherine. She saw him at the same time and gave a small, hesitant wave. He walked over and sat beside her. They sat in a comfortable silence for a few moments, watching children play on a nearby lawn. "Richard is doing better," she said finally, looking at her hands. "He's learning. We both are. Learning to live a smaller, quieter life. It's strange, but it's not as bad as I thought it would be." "I'm glad to hear that," Mark said, and he meant it. "What you did," she started, then stopped. "It felt like cruelty at the time, like you were burning our whole world down. But you weren't. You were a controlled burn. You were clearing out the dead wood so something new could grow." She turned to look at him, her eyes clear. It was an act of profound and painful grace. "Thank you." Mark was taken aback. He had never thought of it that way. He had seen it as a necessary, destructive act, a demolition. But Catherine was right. It was also a form of creation. He had created the possibility for change, for growth, for everyone involved. "I have to go," she said, standing up. She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Be well, Mark." He watched her walk away, a woman no longer defined by her husband's shadow, but finding her own way in the sun. He sat on the bench for a long time, thinking about the nature of strength. The Davenports had believed strength was loud, that it was about dominance and control. They had been wrong. True strength was quiet. It was the strength of deep foundations, of patient design, of knowing your own worth so completely that you don't need anyone else to validate it. It was the strength to endure humiliation with dignity, to hold immense power with restraint, and to offer fairness when you have every right to seek revenge. He had lost a wife and a family, but he had reclaimed himself. He was no longer a supporting character in someone else's story. He was the architect of his own. And as he stood up and walked home, the city skyline stretching out before him, he knew with a deep, abiding certainty that the future he would build would be beautiful, honest, and strong. It would be a structure built not on arrogance or illusion, but on the solid, unshakable bedrock of integrity. and it would be entirely his. This story is a powerful reminder that our true value isn't determined by the opinions of others, but by our own character and integrity. It's about the quiet strength that often goes unseen and the importance of earning respect, not just demanding it. What did you think of Mark's decision? Was it justice or was it revenge? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as compelling as I did, please give it a like and subscribe for more content that makes you think and feel. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.